Welcome to Mr. Hutchings' History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so today we're diving deep into a pivotal moment in the fight for civil rights, the Selma campaign of 1965. You probably know some of the basics, but there's a lot more to uncover.
Yeah, one thing that really stands out is even after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, voting rights were still highly contested, especially in the South.
And Selma, Alabama really became like the epicenter of that fight, and we'll see why as we get deeper. Imagine a place where Black residents make up half the population, but only 23 out of 15,000 eligible Black voters were registered.
Yeah, it's a really stark example of how deeply ingrained segregation was at the time. We're not just talking about voting, it was everything. Separate schools, separate jobs, even, separate drinking fountains. It was just woven into life in Selma.
Wow. And right at the heart of this system was Sheriff Jim Clark. He was a really vocal segregationist who became infamous for, well, using intimidation and violence to suppress Black voter registration. He's like a symbol of the brutal resistance to equality.
All right, and that's where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, come in. And they didn't just pick Selma randomly. It was a strategic move, and understanding that strategy is key to understanding the whole impact of the Selma campaign.
So what made Selma like the perfect battleground for them?
Well, several things. First, they knew that Sheriff Clark's brutality, as horrific as it was, it could be used to expose the reality of voter suppression to the nation. They'd see this before. Remember Bull Connor in Birmingham?
Right. Those images of police dogs and fire hoses turned on peaceful protesters, those were broadcast everywhere, and it really changed public opinion.
Yeah, exactly. So King and the SCLC, they were hoping for something similar in Selma. They knew that media coverage of Clark's actions could force the government to act. But there's another layer to this that makes it even more complex. Not all the local activists were happy with SCLC coming in.
Really?
Well,
Why is that?
Some worried that, years of groundwork by local groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee or SNCC would be overshadowed. They felt the SCLC with the other national profile and Dr. King might come in, get the attention, and then leave without addressing the deeper systemic issues in Selma.
Oh, I see. It wasn't as simple as it might seem on the surface.
Exactly. It's a reminder that history is, rarely straightforward. There are always multiple perspectives and competing interests.
So how did this tension play out as the campaign got going?
Well, you see it in how things unfolded. There were marches to the courthouse, voter registration drives that were met with a lot of opposition, and mass arrests, including Dr. King himself. These events were designed to provoke a response from Sheriff Clark and draw national attention to what was happening.
So they were hoping Clark would overreact and give them those dramatic images they needed.
Exactly. And it worked. Remember that quote from Dr. King's letter from jail? He said, "There are more Negroes in jail with me than there are on the voting rolls." It's a powerful statement about the situation in Selma.
They really used their arrest to amplify their message. That's incredible. And risky.
It was. And then came a turning point. A real tragedy that galvanized the movement. The death of Jimmy Lee Jackson.
Yeah, things took a dark turn there.
Jackson was shot by a state trooper while protecting his mother during a peaceful protest in a nearby town. This horrific event and the continued violence from white supremacists just fueled the outrage across the country. I mean, they even threw poisonous snakes at Black citizens trying to register to vote.
Wow, that's just unbelievable. And through all of this, how did Dr. King manage the tension between wanting to provoke a response but also keeping his followers safe?
Well, there's this one incident where Sheriff Clark is brutally beating a Black woman, and King actually stops his followers from interfering. He understood the power of those images, that seeing this unprovoked violence captured on film would be way more effective in turning public opinion against the segregationists than any kind of physical retaliation.
It seems like he was thinking way ahead, almost anticipating the 24/7 news cycle we have now.
Yeah. And that brings us to Bloody Sunday, probably one of the most pivotal events in the whole civil rights movement. The Selma to Montgomery March, a 54-mile journey, a direct confrontation with the state. A moment that changed history.
Okay, I'm ready. Set the scene for me.
It's March 7th, 1965. 600 marchers, led by Dr. King, try to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
What happens?
They're met with just unbelievable brutality. The state troopers, they unleashed tear gas, charged on horseback, swinging clubs. Those images broadcast across the country were just shocking. It was a turning point that forced President Johnson to finally act.
Oh, I can't believe we've already covered so much, and we're just getting to Bloody Sunday. This is incredible.
Oh, there's so much more to come. We'll explore what happened after Bloody Sunday, the Voting Rights Act itself, and the complex legacy of Selma in our next segment.
I can't wait. I'm hooked.
Welcome back. As we dig deeper into Selma's legacy, it's hard to ignore the echoes of this campaign in today's world.
Yeah, it's almost like history is repeating itself in a way, especially with the ongoing fight for voting rights and voter suppression tactics and, the struggles against systemic racism that are still happening.
Yeah, exactly. Selma reminds us that progress isn't, a straight line. The Voting Rights Act was huge, but it didn't magically erase, centuries of prejudice.
Yeah, it feels like we're still dealing with those same issues, just in different forms. Efforts to restrict voting, especially in minority communities, gerrymandering, voter ID laws, limited polling places. It's like a new playbook for an old game.
And it's so important to see these tactics as part of a bigger system, one that's meant to disenfranchise certain groups. It reminds us that we can't let our guard down.
It really makes you wonder what Dr. King would say if he saw these attempts to, undermine the very rights he fought for.
It does. But I think his words from the Selma campaign are still so relevant. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. It's a message of hope, but also a call to action.
That's so true. So where do we even begin? It feels so overwhelming sometimes.
I know. But remember, the Selma campaign was built on the efforts of everyday people. People who decided they wouldn't stand for injustice anymore.
It was a grassroots movement, driven by passion and a belief in a better future. That's something we can all tap into, right? You don't have to be a famous leader to make a difference.
Exactly. You can educate yourself, talk about voting rights with others, and support organizations doing this work. Every action matters.
It's about recognizing that silence is complicity. We have to speak up, challenge the status quo, hold our leaders accountable.
And remember, voting rights aren't just about casting a ballot. It's about making sure everyone's voice is heard, that everyone has an equal chance to shape their society.
It's about the very core of democracy. Without equal access to voting, the system doesn't work the way it's supposed to.
It undermines fairness and representation. And it just perpetuates these cycles of inequality that affect everything.
When certain groups are excluded from the political process, their needs get ignored and power stays in the hands of a few.
Exactly. So, reflecting on Selma, let's not just commemorate the past, but let's use it to fuel action in the present.
Yeah, let's honor the sacrifices made by carrying that torch forward. Okay, so we've talked about the history of Selma, but now let's talk about how historians have interpreted this event. It's not as simple as you might think.
Right. The legacy of Selma has been debated a lot. There isn't one agreed-upon interpretation. So let's look at some of the major schools of thought.
Okay, hit me.
All right, first, the traditional view, sometimes called the traditionalist school. They see Selma as the moment, the one event that led to the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, that's what you usually hear, right? Bloody Sunday was so shocking that it forced President Johnson to act, but there must be other views, right?
There are, and this is where it gets interesting. Then there's the continuity school. They see Selma as super important, but they say it was part of a much longer process, building on years of, local activism. They argue that focusing only on Selma kind of overlooks the work of those organizers who'd been fighting for years.
So it wasn't just this one big event.
Right. Think about SNCC, those activists we talked about. They've been working on the ground, facing danger for years. Selma was a flashpoint, but it was built on their work.
Wow, so it's way more complex than just one event. What other perspectives are there?
Okay, so then there's the radical school of thought. They acknowledge the Voting Rights Act as a big win, but they say it wasn't enough. It didn't deal with the deeper economic and social inequalities that were still there, especially outside the South.
So they see it as a victory, but also like a reminder that more needs to be done.
Yeah. A historian named Jean Theo Harris, she argues that focusing on federal legislation, distracted from the need for more radical economic changes. And that's a debate we're still having, right? We're still struggling with systemic racism and economic inequality. The radical school would say Selma didn't really fix those root problems.
That's an important point. Even within the civil rights movement, there were disagreements about the best way forward, about what true equality really means. So we've got the traditionalists, the continuity folks, the radicals. Are there any other big schools of thought about Selma?
One more. The social historians. They shift the focus away from the big names, the national leaders, and look at the local heroes of Selma, the people who made it all happen. They're interested in people like Amelia Boynton Robinson, a local organizer who was key in bringing Dr. King and the SCLC to Selma.
So they're saying that history is made by everyone, not just the big names we see in textbooks.
Exactly. That's what makes history so interesting. It's not just dates and names. It's about these different perspectives, all these forces at play, and all these individuals who contribute to change.
Okay, so the Voting Rights Act gets signed into law on August 6th, 1965, a massive achievement. It gets rid of those discriminatory voting practices like literacy tests and poll taxes. But even with that,
The struggle wasn't over. The act removed legal barriers, but it didn't solve the deep economic challenges that Black Americans faced, especially in the North, where things were less overt but still very unequal.
and we see divisions growing within the movement itself. Groups like SNCC are questioning the nonviolent approach, looking for more radical ways to create lasting change.
It shows that even within a powerful movement, there were disagreements about the best path forward. That's something we'll talk about more as we continue exploring the civil rights movement.
We've covered a lot, but I think the takeaway here is that Selma wasn't just about one place or one thing. It was a symbol, the result of years of struggle, and a moment that forced the whole country to see the reality of racial injustice.
Right. And as we reflect on Selma, we have to remember that the fight for equality didn't end there. The Voting Rights Act was huge, but the struggle for equal rights is still going on.
It makes you think, what are the parallels to the fights for voting rights happening right now?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll grapple with in our next segment. The fight for equality continues, and understanding the past helps us understand the challenges we're facing today.
We've explored the history, the impact, even those unsettling parallels between Selma and the fight for voting rights today.
And as we wrap up our deep dive into Selma, I kind of want to leave you with a question, something to really think about.
Ooh, I like it. Go ahead.
All right, so the Selma campaign was all about the right to vote, a fundamental part of political power. But what about economic power? How do we deal with those economic differences that still affect marginalized communities, even after all the progress of the civil rights movement?
Yeah, that's a big one. It's like Selma opened the door to political participation, but economically, things aren't equal.
Right. And that inequality, it can actually undermine the progress made on voting rights. If people are struggling just to get by, how can they really participate fully in the political process?
Yeah, it's like a catch-22. Economic hardship limits your access, your influence, which makes it harder to fight for policies that could help.
Exactly. So how do we break that cycle? How do we make sure the fight for equality goes beyond voting into the way our economy works?
It's more than just voting. It's about economic justice, about everyone having a fair chance no matter where they come from.
It's about wealth inequality, access to education and healthcare, and helping communities that have been disadvantaged.
You know, it makes me think about those activists in Selma, the ones who are fighting for more than just the vote. They wanted a better life, a fairer system for their families and communities.
And that's the challenge for us now. How do we channel that same energy, that drive for real change, to deal with the economic inequalities that are still so deep in our society? Because political rights, without economic opportunity, that's not really enough.
Right. It's complex, for sure. No easy answers. But maybe the first step is just recognizing the connection, seeing how economic justice and political power, they're tied together.
Definitely. We need to see that the fight for equality has many sides. We have to tackle it on different fronts, from protecting voting rights to changing the systems that create economic inequality.
So as we finish up this look at the Selma campaign, let's not just think about the Voting Rights Act. Let's see Selma as a starting point for a much bigger movement for social and economic justice.
Let's keep pushing for policies and changes that create a more just society for everyone.
Because the dream of real equality, the dream that motivated those people marching from Selma to Montgomery, is a dream worth fighting for. And it needs us to act, to stay committed.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What will you do? What actions will you take to make sure Selma isn't just history, but something that shapes our society today? Until next time, keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings' History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.